Hi guys, Paul from Vizu and Paramount Performance here. You may have seen a video we did quite recently where we purchased this old girl. We were looking for a Jaguar XF to do some development work on, particularly to develop some exhaust systems, a switchable system that isn't currently available, and an air induction system too. And we did look at a few, dare I say, slightly doggy examples before we bought this one. So we got this in the end for a bargain price of £7,000, but we did know there were a few issues that we actually need to deal with, of course, before we can start tuning and adding new parts and new power. Anybody that knows me will know that I often say things like, you've got to make sure the foundations of the car are right before you start tuning. And what this really means is you don't want to be tuning a car with underlying issues. And whilst this car came for great money and looks like it's in really great condition, there are a few issues we need to deal with. So let's get her up in the air and let's go through some of those things first. Okay, so here we are underneath our new pride and joy. And when we initially inspected this vehicle before we purchased it, there were a few things that we identified that we knew were going to need fixing. And many of these come down to three categories. First of all, when we drove the vehicle on road test, it just didn't feel right. It felt quite unstable on the road, a little bit wobbly. And when we drove hard and accelerated hard, it pulled to the left. And when braking, it seems to want to pull to the right. Now, if you're looking to buy a vehicle and you get these type of symptoms, do take your time here. You probably want to get somebody involved. It could be a sign of potentially even quite a nasty accident damage that has meant the geometry of the vehicle is off. In this case, we're pretty sure it came down to the suspension bushes. Not particularly unusual on these vehicles, and as they get a little bit older, the rubber starts to perish, you get a little bit of free play, and the vehicle starts to wobble around and not feel quite right. So we were quite sure, we thought we knew what it was going to be, and now we've got it up on a ramp, we're going to take a look and see just what's going on here. I'm going to ask Andy here, my glamorous assistant, to come in. Well, at least my assistant anyway. And we're going to take a look at these front suspension bushes, which do tend to be a bit problematic. So let's see if that's where the issue is on this vehicle. So Andy's now up in the suspension bush here, and I don't know if you can see that clear enough, but you'll see this whole wheel is starting to move backwards and forwards. And that's because that rubber's gone soft and it's allowing too much free play. And as that's on the road, it's going to feel pretty bloody horrible. So we're pretty certain it's now these bushes that need to be changed. So I think we're pretty confident about what's going on with the suspension now. Two other issues we need to look at on this particular vehicle. The brakes are pretty damn worn. Now we knew this because it was actually flagged on the last MOT that the brakes were heading towards the end of their life. And I don't know if you can just take a look up here. You can see they are very, very corroded. And we're going to be tuning this vehicle for quite a lot more power. We're going to end up with about 710 brake horsepower. So with all that additional power, we want to make sure the brakes are absolutely great. So we're not going to mess around, and you shouldn't mess around with brakes. New pads and discs all the way around. Now, if you were looking to get this done at the main dealer using Jaguar parts, you're probably going to be talking about £1,200, possibly even a little bit more. On a vehicle of this age, this mileage, I'm a big fan of aftermarket parts. You're going to save a lot of money, and the job will probably be done for about £600–700 at an aftermarket specialist. If you are going aftermarket, one thing that I would always say is make sure you're fitting quality parts, particularly when we're talking about brakes. We have seen quite recently some aftermarket parts that are coming in from outside of the UK and outside of Europe. They're copy parts, they're very poor quality, and they're not coming with the EC certificate number that all parts sold in Europe should have. So it's fine to go outside of the dealer network by all means, but make sure they're fitting EC certified parts, particularly when we're talking about things like brakes and suspension. And that's exactly what we're going to do with this girl. So we're going aftermarket on this, new pads, new discs all the way around. So it's going to help make sure that we know how to stop when we're adding all this extra power. So the last thing I want to talk about, particularly on this car, and we need to fix before we can start tuning it, is rust. Now, unfortunately, Jaguar Land Rover don't have a very strong reputation here. And, you know, whilst we love the cars very much, there are stories of Land Rover Defenders leaving the factory and having the chassis painted with grease so they didn't rust even before they got to the dealerships. And whilst they've moved on a little bit from that, they do have a legacy of rust. And on a car like this, which is 2009, if we don't address this, it can be quite literally a car killer. The rust can get so bad that it can't be repaired, or the repair actually outweighs the cost of the car and keeping it on the road. So if you've got a Jaguar, just because you've got an aluminium body and it all looks lovely, don't be resting on your laurels thinking it's fine. Underneath you might have a nightmare in the making, and that actually is exactly what we've got here. There's some quite serious rust. It has not got structural yet. If I'm honest, we wouldn't have bought the car if it had. I think we've caught this one early enough, but it needs treatment and it needs treating now. And I'm just going to show you a couple of these examples. So this chassis member here is not replaceable. This is a fundamental structural part of the car. You could in theory put a plate on it if you could get to it, but you're now talking about taking the fuel tank out and God knows what else. So the answer is treat it now before it gets too bad. So this chassis member on both sides is pretty bloody bad and needs treatment. This cross member here is a separate item and can be removed, and it's absolutely rotten through. And by the way, if you're watching this thinking, hey, this car's got no exhaust system, that's because it's been taken off and is now with our fabricating team, because job number one we want to do on this car is develop a switchable exhaust system, which is going to be absolutely market leading. So the exhaust is already off, so don't be worried that it didn't come with an exhaust system, it did. And then the other issue on this particular car, and it's very common on the Jaguar XKs and the XFs, is this rear subframe. It's a big chunk of metal, it's an expensive chunk of metal. £4,000 to £5,000 to replace this with new. Yes, you could potentially get a second-hand one for quite a lot less, but it's a big job to change. So the answer is, inspect yours now. If you've in any doubt at all, rust treat it. And you'll see here there's quite a lot of surface corrosion. So we're going to clean this up and we're going to treat it. And we're going to treat it in two ways. A little bit over the top in some ways, but we think it's best. We're going to strip the rust off as much as we can, and we're then going to treat the car with LanoGuard. This is like a penetrating oil that soaks into the steel and stops further corrosion. We're going to let that dry, and then we're going to wax oil it, which is a thick, black, sticky substance. It really literally sticks to like a blanket, and we're going to make sure that no further corrosion takes place. And that treatment combined is probably good for at least 4 to 5 years. And this car needs it urgently. So Andy's going to crack straight on with that now, and that's the 3 jobs we've got lined up. We're going to do the suspension, then we're going to get the geometry check to make sure all wheels are pointing where we want them to point. We're going to change the brakes all the way around, new pads, new discs, take the calipers off, service the calipers, get them refitted so we know we're going to be able to stop when we add all this new power. And to preserve this vehicle and make sure it's on the road for the next 4 to 5 years, we're going to heavily treat the rust and stop that dead where we can. So, Andy, it's time to get involved. So, and with the magic of television, as they used to say, you join us back in the Visu workshop 2 days later, and Andy has been busy. First of all, we've removed all the loose rust from underneath the vehicle. It's had 2 heavy coats of LanoGuard. If you don't know what LanoGuard is, it's a bit like a penetrating oil that actually gets into the surface of the rust and the metal and then dries to stop water getting in. It's a very, very good rust protection. So it's had 2 heavy coats of LanoGuard which have been allowed to dry, and then a really nice thick coat of wax oil, which quite literally is a black, thick, waxy oil that never quite sets. So it's really good. It doesn't ship off, it doesn't become dry and brittle, it stays flexible and really stops water getting into the car. The advantage of these 2 applications together, it could be seen maybe we've gone a bit over the top, but this car did have quite a bit of rust and I wanted to nail this issue closed. So it's had both applications, and that should be good for about 4 to 5 years, to be honest. And I'll say again, if you've got a Jaguar and you want to keep it, even if it's fairly new, you do want to carry out some rust protection because it is a bit of a problem on these vehicles. The advantage is if it's quite new, you're going to stop the rust even getting started. If it's a little bit older, 4, 5 or 6 years, there will be rust under your car and you want to treat it now before it gets any worse. So we'll just give you a quick tour around underneath. Andy has fitted new brakes and pads and discs all round. He's also painted the calipers, which is a little bit of a nice touch while they're off. So we've got another nice sporty red brake caliper, and that's bound to give it at least another 5 brake horsepower. Well, maybe. And you'll see obviously now these suspension components are both wax oiled and nicely coated with the LanoGuard as well, so we're not going to get any further penetration of rust there. And as we work our way back, you'll see we've changed this bar. We talked about that earlier. We've actually changed the mounts of that bar too, because when we came to take this bar off, it was so rusted it just wouldn't separate. So we've changed mounts on both sides. So I'm pleased that is now going to last for the lifetime of the car. And the subframe has been stripped back of any loose rust. Again, that's been coated and you'll see it's got a really nice thick protective coat of wax oil on there now. So I'm really happy this car is now ready to hit the road. We need to obviously refit the exhaust system. We've changed those suspension bushes which are old and tired and worn at the front too. So the next thing we're going to have to do is get the exhaust on, and then it's going to go for geometry just to make sure that the wheel alignment is all correct, and then we can start tuning. So I'm really looking forward to the next stage. I hope you're going to join us. As you know, we're on YouTube and Facebook, and if you're into your Jaguars and modifying them, join our Jaguar Mod Squad, which is particularly for customers that are modifying their vehicles, want helps and tips, and just to share the joy of the journey with us. So keep tuned, and I hope to speak to you soon.